Okay, so let's take a couple of minutes here, just a couple of minutes at the start of the class to make sure we know what we're up to. At the beginning of the quarter, doing some basic kind of formal analysis and thinking about how the visual form of these works of art represents societal views or what's going on in the context of the time. I want us to, again, to set our groundwork to make sure we have a really solid foundation. Most of you haven't had art history before. I want you to know what we're doing over and over again at the beginning of the quarter. I'm going to kind of repeat the same method until it's like, okay, this is what he's talking about. So the first thing is we started last time with a very, very long discussion about the context, right? And what we were trying to say is these are the big things going on in the world that have an impact on why the art looks the way that it does, why they choose particular subject matter on the one hand, but even more importantly, why they represent it the way they do on the other hand. So you're always going to be thinking, what did he say about the context? And it's almost always going to be a big overview that I say, hey, for instance, in this case, we have the rise of the middle class. The rise of the middle class then begets an interest in humanistic values. Those values have to be found somewhere other than medieval culture by and large, and so they look back to ancient classical cultures like Rome and Greece. And this then begets the idea eventually of not just humanism in a kind of broader sense, but idealism, perfecting ourselves, making ourselves better, and that's going to show up in the art. That's your synopsis, but in any exam or in any paper, you're going to want to have a nice, strong paragraph on that saying, here are the key features of the context, and here's how they impact the art. What we see happening, and if we were to start this story earlier on, you would have seen art that looks really not realistic at all. Very flat, very linear, very stylized, things that look like, honestly, just not like human beings at all. And a lot of people think, well, those artists weren't very good. The medieval artists or the Byzantine artists just didn't know how to do it right. That's preposterous. If you've ever taken an art class before, you know that you can learn basic technique pretty quickly and make things look roughly accurate if that's your goal. If it's not your goal, you're never going to do it, which is exactly why it didn't happen in the medieval period. That wasn't their goal, to make things look human. That's not their culture. Their culture is about pointing you towards heaven, pointing you towards another world. This world didn't matter so much. Why would you represent anything looking like this world? So we have then the shift, and it begets, again, art that starts to look more naturalistic early on, and we're in a stage at the end of the Renaissance where it's looking idealistic. So we talk about the context, but we also talk about what is its connection to the visual form of these works of art? How did it influence these works of art? You always want to make that kind of connection. Early on in the quarter, we spent a lot of time talking about style. Remember what style is. Style is what we expect to find visually, in particular, in works of art produced during a particular time period in a particular locale. In other words, the general characteristics that you expect to see. We could talk about that in any number of ways and give any number of examples in your everyday world, right? The world in which you live this year, something will come into style when it comes to clothing, and everyone will wear it, and then it'll go out of style. Think of paintings as like that, but not quite as simplistic, let's say, as clothing styles. Something is influencing people. People are drawn to particular ways of representing things. We see those general characteristics in their works of art. So the reason I want you to know about style is not because it's the end-all, be-all of art history. I could care less about style. It's a nice, quick way to be thinking generally about what the visual characteristics of works of art during this time period might be. And it's also a really good way to get you to look really carefully and say, okay, here's what he's talking about when it comes to style. So what are our stylistics of the Italian Renaissance or classical style? We have, first of all, we've got ideals. It's always going to be ideal. Everything has to be perfect. It's got to be perfect. Why? And then we get back to this other thing that's kind of subtending both style and context, and aesthetic philosophy. How many people are still scratching your head a little bit about Neoplatonic thought or Plato and Aristotle? Raise your hands. Are you still like, I'm not entirely sure? Okay, before tomorrow's section, look that over and bring any questions you have to section. Remember, the key part is this, and I think this is pretty straightforward, but you need to have a nice little paragraph ready to go when you're writing your essays for your exams, or in your big summary essay assignment that you'll have as a writing assignment. You'll want to say, here's the aesthetic philosophy of classicism, or here's the aesthetic philosophy of mannerism, or here's the aesthetic philosophy of the Baroque period, all of which we'll get to. In this case, it's this paragraph. It has to start with, Christians believe God is the divine craftsman, that he's perfect and all-knowing. Christians believe that this world was made by God and we were made by God in his image. Now, it's a standard kind of easy form of logic to say, if he's perfect and he knows everything and he made this world, there must be something of his perfection in this world and in us. And yet, as human beings, bound by our senses, we don't oftentimes see that. We look around the world and we don't see the order that, again, subtends or is implicit in the world of appearances, or the phenomenal realm, as Plato put it. So who helps us to see that? And originally, those were people like the priests, and now it's artists who have elevated their status to someone who can show you something that is a matter of knowledge. Right? That's your basic bottom line. And then you say, well, then why does an artist create an ideal? And the answer is, again, very, very logical, because the ideal is a manifestation of the divine in front of you. It's not just about creating a pretty picture where we say, well, that's beautiful. The beautiful means God. That's Neoplatonism. The beautiful is a reflection of God. And I don't mean, again, sensual beauty. This is rational beauty, beauty that appeals to the mind, to the intellect, something that is of the order of God. Not just, wow, that guy's totally hot, I'm going to sculpt him. It's not about that. It's about knowledge. Then you want to backtrack. The trickier part is, how does Plato get into that story? How does Aristotle get into the story? What is that all about? And if you still have questions on that, again, we have Panopto lectures on this that you could go back and look over again and bring those questions to section. It's your responsibility, once something's come through a lecture, to either raise the questions with me or raise them with Haley, or go look at that Panopto lecture again. Come hit me up during office hours or send me an email. And in this case, I always want to follow this rule, and I think it's a really good rule for you to use with every single class you have. When you have a question on something, tell the professor or the TA what you do know. Like, here's what I've got. This is what I understand so far. I'm a little bit unclear on this idea, or I'm not sure that I'm getting this exactly right. Can you clarify this for me? Makes it easier for us. We know exactly where you're falling off the bus on this, or where you have some questions still, and we can respond pretty quickly. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay. So then we go on to the specifics of these works of art, and we want to be thinking about always how does the visual language of these works of art get communicated through the formal elements? Or another way to put this is, and again, I think we figured out last time I turn this all down, we get better image. We want to be thinking about this. We've got a standard subject matter here, something that you'll see a few times in this class. It's your basic story. It's the Annunciation. And the bottom line story, like the cliff notes for this, are God needs to send his Son to earth to save us from our sins. Or rather, God needs to kind of manifest himself in human form as Jesus Christ on earth to save us from our sins. He needs a vehicle for himself to become human in a way, or for his Son to be born. And that vehicle is one of the most pure women on earth, the Virgin Mary. So the story unfolds that he tells Gabriel, his right-hand man, the angel, to go to the Virgin Mary and ask her if she's willing to be the handmaiden of the Lord. And she is. And it's right at that moment that he says, "Hail, most favored one, Lord be with you," blah, 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 blah. And she says, I'm ready, got this under control, no problem, I'll do it. That she is impregnated, or the Christ is incarnated in her. Now, one of the things that makes us special, so that we don't think, okay, it's just an everyday thing, is that this type of impregnation is unlike any other that I've ever heard of, right? It happens without sex. There's no sex, there's no in vitro, there's none of that kind of stuff. She's just pregnant by the Word of God. So that's your basic story. Now, that story can be told in a million different ways. And if you've ever seen a remake of a movie, or as I said last time, your favorite song gets redone by someone that you totally detest, you know how these other representations of the story are going to change the story. And your task in an introductory level art history class is really to tell me how that story is being retold by this artist, using this particular kind of line, or that particular kind of color, or this particular kind of composition. And so when we look at things and we say, for instance here, hey, Virgin Mary doesn't look like she's all that surprised about this. Her facial expression looks pretty calm, what you learn to call riposo, or inner calm. That's perfectly logical for this time period, because what we want to do is tell the story in a way that really emphasizes the fact that she is kind of exemplary. She's better than most of us. She doesn't get surprised by the fact that, you know, an angel shows up in her room and tells her she's going to be the handmaiden of the Lord, right? And beyond that, so you start with that, you look at her facial expression, you say, okay, I don't need art history. I see, she's totally calm. I've got it. No, everything else in this work is set up to make it calm and ordered and easy. So we've got a very, very clear focal point, right? Look here first, an amazing amount of organization of the picture. Look at the Virgin Mary, then look over there at Gabriel, and then you see everything in the foreground and a little wall behind it. Just look here first. Why do I look at that garden? Because it's called a hortus conclusus, enclosed garden, right? It's a symbol of her virginity. Why does Gabriel have this lily in his hand, that white lily? This is another symbol for you. Symbolic of her virginity again. So push, push, push the idea of virginity, virginity, virginity. No emotionality in this whatsoever. So you've got two major things going on here in the foreground. Virgin, meaning, again, immaculate, miraculous type of birth. And, again, calm. Something ordered, something godly, something that is exemplary, the way you're supposed to react. And then you look to the middle ground, where you've got some of those trees. And then you look into the deep background, which are all ancillary, not as important as the first part. All God's realm, though. And what do we see there? More and more ideals. Why ideals? Because godlike again. We want to make this whole thing godlike. Ideal proportions of the Virgin Mary, ideal reaction from her, ideal proportions in Gabriel, ideal delineation of space, of foreground, middle ground, background, the use of central one-point perspective. Remember linear perspective? That's not the way your eye sees the world. That's perfect space. So you're starting to look at all these things, and then you're adding them up, and you're saying, oh yeah, and in addition to that, we have a lot of analogous colors. They harmonize with one another, right? We've got a lot of forms in this that are pyramidal, or at least horizontal and vertical. These are very ordered and stable, all of which create calm in us. In other words, you're looking at each part, each little building block of the painting. You're saying, what is the effect or the quality of this? What impact does it have? And just jot it down. I mean, you won't be so far off that you'd get it wrong. I mean, I doubt many of you would ever say, these colors are so loud and obnoxious, it's creating a ton of emotion in this work, right? And if you are, come see me. Yeah, you jot all those things down, and then you add them up. You say, what do all these things do to modify that subject matter? How is this story being told here? And that's a lot of the first part of the corridor. So once you get to that part, then all we're doing is thinking, okay, we see how this story is being told. I see how the artist is using these formal elements so as to modify this story or to tell it in a particular way. I know something about the context, so I know why they're telling it in this way. Because for people of this time, these types of things mattered, right? Humanistic values, or the idea of making us all perfect, making us better, really mattered. Making exemplary figures like the Virgin Mary, someone to look at and emulate and want to be like, really matters during this time period, and on and on. Right, so linear one-point perspective, I can't emphasize this enough, and I certainly want to see this in your papers and in your exams. It's not just a really cool way to represent illusion. I mean, it is that, right? So most of you, when you're little kids, learn that parallel lines tend to look like they're converging as they get further away from you and go off into the distance, but this is a regularization of that. This is the idea that there's one vanishing point along a horizon line, and all lines that are basically perpendicular to that will recede to that same vanishing point, whether they be the edges of this concrete, the tops of the buildings, or what have you. Now, the key here is not just about illusion, it's about creating perfect, ordered space. This is that perfection that God put into the universe that we don't see, but it's underneath it all. So if you generate, again, a picture based upon all of these ideals, colors and lines and shapes, and in this case, space, you come up with something that is a godly picture, basically a manifestation of like heaven in front of you. While we're on space, before I go too far away, I just want to give you some terms. This isn't specific to the Renaissance. Artists use this all the time, right? There's a million different ways that you create the illusion of three-dimensionality, but a pretty fancy one is this. See how everything that's in the foreground is nice, high definition, lots of accurate detail, and then as you get further away, it keeps blending into the distance, it keeps losing its detail, it keeps losing its color and so forth. That is called atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective. And there's an easy way to remember this. Just think there's more atmosphere in front of you and things that are further away than things that are closer to you, and it will obscure the color and the detail. So an artist just mimics that in their painting. This is a big work. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So again, we have a big subject matter that I'll come to in a minute. This is a work that will be one of the choices that you have for your summary essay assignment. That summary essay is going to be about a 3-page essay based upon the fundamental principles of this class, which is I tell you a lot of things, you read some things, you talk about things in section and discussion, then you compile them and compress them into a 3-page essay in which you tell me all the relevant details about this in an organized essay. So take good notes on this, right? First of all, you're looking at it in situ, as they say, where it was actually painted. This is it's a type of fresco painting, but not the true fresco or buono fresco, which we'll get to in a minute. This is fresco secco, which is basically a mural painting. He painted it on a dry wall. Fresco buono, or true fresco, is a kind of fresco in which you paint on wet plaster, and in the process of the plaster drying, it bonds chemically with the paint, and it's much more durable. But Leonardo didn't want to do that because he wanted a much more luminous picture, and so he combined a bunch of techniques, and it failed. Within a year, it was already peeling off of the wall. So you're going to look at an incredibly deteriorated painting. But it's still something that we can see a lot of his organizational principles in here. So originally this was in a library, but very quickly it was turned into what's called a refectory. And a refectory is a place where priests or monks go to eat, kind of like a mess hall. So you can imagine how thematically this fit in so nicely with that. You'd be sitting down for a meal and you'd look down to the end of the room and it would look as if the end wall had dissolved and you were looking at a scene of the Last Supper. By the way, all of this door that was cut in here was cut in afterwards when the thing was so deteriorated that some people are like, well, it's easier to get out here, so let's just cut through this painting and go out this wall. How many people have seen this in a book or something before? You're like, yeah, this looks kind of familiar. Yeah, it's a little bit like the Mona Lisa. There's a lot of renditions of this out there. And I just want to start you again with the subject matter. And again, this is the generic, here's what the Last Supper is all about. And again, we're just presuming in this class that these are Christian stories. We're not, buying into the dogma here, but we do need to tell you what the belief system is. So the Last Supper is a moment right before Christ's betrayal that I'll get to in a minute, when he gathers together his closest followers, basically his posse, which are known as the apostles, and there's 12 of them. They're all dudes, all guys, right? And these are his closest followers who've been gathering around him for a while now. They'll be tasked after his death to go on and kind of proselytize and spread the word of Christ. But right now, he's gathered them together for a last meal, the Last Supper. And two big things happen at this. And the artist will emphasize one of these two things. What we're looking at here is the betrayal. That's one of the things that happens. So he gets them all around the table, and just imagine this. You've got all your best buddies around the table. You all like each other. And this case, it's even bigger than that, right? This guy's the Son of God on earth. He's seen as the Messiah. All these people believe this entirely. Gets him around the table, start having a meal, and he says, hey, by the way, I've got something to tell you. One of you is going to betray me. One of you is going to betray me. How is this artist going to represent that moment? Because that's what we're seeing. Don't confuse this as going on in this work, but the other thing that goes on at the Last Supper, just so you know, is that Christ does this super fancy thing where he turns the wine on the table into his blood and the bread on the table into his body. And this is the basis for the sacrament of the Holy Communion, as it's known, or the Eucharistic ceremony. That's not happening here, but you'll see that emphasized. And that's a really kind of mystical element to this. It's based upon old ritual sacrifices without any question. It's about being so pure that you can imbibe or take Christ into your own body and kind of immerse yourself in his spirit. But here we've got the betrayal. So my question is, again, just to give you a moment to practice this, and we won't do this a lot in the large lecture because we'll get way too far behind. You'll do more of this when you can in sections, but I want to make sure that you can check in with each other and really get this stuff down. We've got a story being told in a very particular way, and granted, it's not a great picture anymore because most of the paint has flaked off, but I bet you can get the basis for this, and I want you to put yourself in this spot again. Your best buddies are all around you. These are the people you love. Let's even say it's part of your family, if you like your family, by the way. And you're all around the table, and all of a sudden, someone at the table says, hey, someone's going to betray me here. How did this artist represent this? How is this very typical of high Renaissance representations, and why would he represent it this way? Just turn to your nearest 2 or 3 neighbors, and for about a minute, share your thoughts on this. How is this being represented? So what do you think? Right off the bat, what can you tell me? Let's say we have to say this version of the story is being told this way. What would your thesis statement be? And I'm not asking for a polished thesis here, but just a general thing. It should be a moment where everyone freaks the heck out, right? What's going on? Yeah.
organized in groups of three, two sets on both sides, so they're like framing him, and then all the lines are converging on him. So he's the focus, and there's like chaos around him, but he's calm.
Good. So let's start with that. Jesus is exemplary. We got that, right? He's always going to be better than the rest of us. I'd be pissed off if all my buddies were going to betray me, right? But he's like, hey, one of you is going to betray me, and they all go relatively crazy. Who the heck would do that? And Jesus is just all like, right? Totally calm. No problem. That's called riposo, inner calm. You will have read about that in your readings by Baldassare de Castiglione, all of those readings that come out of the PDF file from Jansen that are all numbered individually. Make sure you're keeping up on those. So that's the proper way to respond. Why? Why? Someone help me out. What's going on in the context? What's going on in their belief system that makes that the proper way to respond? Why doesn't he get up and just smite them all? He's Jesus. I smite you, and I know it's you, Judas, anyway, because I'm God on earth. Yeah.
He knows it's like it's like foretold that he has to be betrayed and crucified by one of his apostles.
Okay, absolutely. Think in the background. If he knows all this, we don't know why he's doing it this way, but there is a plan. You got to trust in God. It's supposed to unfold in a particular way. But I want to get to the basic one. Why does he respond just calmly? Yeah. Because it's rational. Because rationality is key. Rationality is the highest function of the human being. That's a part of, again, humanism. You want to be ideal. You want to be perfect. Does that make sense to people? This is the right way to respond. So I'm going to emphasize this. And then, as was pointed out as well, everything focuses on him. He's the focal point. That's the emphasis. Here he is. So how has he made the focal point? All the implied lines of everything in this picture point to him. All the figures look at him, point to him. He is basically the converging, vanishing point of all of the lines for the use of linear one-point perspective in this picture that you can pick out if you look at the top of these dark things that were originally tapestries. All just follow them down where they hit, right here, right? The top of these coffered ceilings, all going to him as well. Focal point. What else makes him a focal point? Help me out. There's a lot of things, yeah. Window behind him, so we got a high contrast, don't we? Light against dark, frames him, makes him stand out. Anyone overlapping Jesus? Nope, no one gets in Jesus' personal space, but everyone else kind of overlaps each other, don't they? Right? Makes him a focal point as well. So first point of emphasis, and then where do you look? What happens next? Can you tell which way you're going to look? I mean, one of the things that bugs me about this is we got Jesus and he's a pyramidal form, so very stable, right? Goes along with his calmness. He's set up with both blue and red. These are symbolic. Blue is heavenly. Red is his passion, both his love as well as, in this case, all the sacrifice he's going to have to go through. And then right next to him you have this. Isn't that an odd thing? Just what we call negative space. There's nothing there. Or rather, there's no figure there. And what shape is that? It's a triangle again, but it's on its tip, isn't it? Does that look stable? No, it's the opposite of stable. Now it's something that could tip either way. Why would you have instability right next to ultimate stability? Got any thoughts? Yeah? Because of Judas, because he's going to die, because Christ is going away. Uh-oh, what's going to happen, right? That kind of possibility of something chaotic occurring. And then we go, again, this is the way I go, see him, look at this space. I go to this grouping, and you've got another pretty important grouping here. This is the only one I need you to remember. In that grouping, when you see, by the way, in most of these scenes, either of a crucifixion or Last Supper, this figure looks like a mirror image of Jesus, except maybe younger, in this case a little bit more effeminate perhaps. That's John the Evangelist. Write it down. John E., important character. It's going to show up a lot here. I'm not going to make you remember all of these people in here, but John the Evangelist you definitely need to know. He's the closest to Jesus. He's considered to be his most beloved follower. He's tasked with the job of taking care of the Virgin Mary after Jesus' death. So you see a kind of mirror image of him. Jesus will be gone, but those who stand in for him, his apostles after his death, will carry on his word. They might create the stability. Right next to him, the old angry guy. When you see old angry guys in these scenes, almost always Peter. Anyone know why Peter's really important?
He's the rock in which Jesus built his church.
Okay, so he says he's the rock on which, from which Jesus builds his church, or upon this rock build my church, so says Jesus to Peter. In other words, Peter is the first bishop of Rome, which is the Pope. It's a way for people to point to why the Pope or the papacy has the power it does. It comes directly from Jesus, and Peter's key in that. And then the other character here is this guy, Judas Iscariot. Judas is the betrayer. He betrayed Jesus for money, 30 pieces of silver. And if you know something about Jesus, he doesn't like money. This guy. I mean, of all the things that Jesus preaches against, it's about greed. Greed is one of the key ones. So this is a big problem. Judas betrays him, but of course, as we know, Judas has a role to play. He's supposed to do this. It's just part of the way that this is going to unfold. So you group those all together in this space. Again, in this case, to the right of Jesus, the right-hand side of figures of Jesus, more often than not, the good people. Judas is in there as well because he's important. Left-hand side, in this case, less important, or sometimes in crucifixion scenes, the outright bad people in those. Then, as was pointed out, very, very ordered. What's weird about this dinner? Well, they're all sitting on the other side of the table as if this is some kind of banquet feast and people are watching them. That's probably not the way it unfolded, but he's made it ideal for us to look at. Everyone's equally spaced apart and grouped into groups of 3. At first, it looks chaotic, and then you're like, no, group of 3, group of 3, group of 3, group of 3. Everything's unified, isn't it? So you look at these different groupings of 3 and then look at these guys. So look at each other. Hey, who the heck could have done that? Hand, 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 all in a row, pointing us and linking us to this group. Who could have done this? Hand, hand, hand. Hand reaches out towards Jesus, connects us to him again, up his body, down the other side over here. Again, grouping, hand, hand, grouping, everything linked together and so forth. Now we don't have a deep background, though, do we? Or at least we can't tell what's going on there. We have foreground and then basically background, but a very clear organization of space. We can't tell what the colors are here, but presume that they weren't incredibly vibrant, or even sometimes when they're more vibrant. Remember, the lighting conditions under which most of these things would have been seen was pretty poor lighting, so everything got muted, so harmonious colors. An emphasis originally would have been on line, so very strong contour lines in this rather than fuzzy edges that appeal to the mind. Use of central point perspective. It's even gotten so rational here that we don't do halos anymore. You probably can't see it, but above this window is what's called a segmented arch, which is just a round arch, like a halo or alluding to a halo, but without the halo itself. So this is a horrible, in my opinion, kind of redo of it. Well, what would it possibly have looked like? Well, absolutely not that. But, at least it gives you a better idea of what this would look like in its original moment. There's some other things to kind of point to. In his hand is the bag of gold. Up on beneath his hand, he has knocked over the shaker of salt. That's symbolic in Italy of bad luck. If you knock over the salt, it's bad luck. It's like a breaking a mirror thing. There's bread shown on the table and wine on the table, referring to the Eucharistic ceremony, even though they're not really emphasizing that. There's your organizational grouping, right? Very, very organized, very, very rational. Again, very calm, collected. Jesus, the right way to respond. And by the way, perfect and beautiful, and if we were to proportion him out, he would definitely be one of those canon and proportion figures. But then what do you do if you want to represent, Judas, who is representative of evil? How do you get to that? And the answer is exactly what you would think. If good is beautiful and true, then ugliness will represent evil and untruth, dissimulation. And rumor has it that Leonardo actually went to the thieves' quarter in Milan and sketched thieves in order to, or ne'er-do-wells, bad guys, in order to get his likeness for Judas. This is a chalk drawing of one of those. The other thing you can get to with Judas here is that of all the figures, and in Renaissance pictures, by the way, let's just come back to this. All Renaissance pictures presume one light source. It's always rational. When we get to the Baroque period or Mannerist period, all bets are off. They'll do whatever they want with light because it is a picture after all. In this case, light is coming from what direction, folks? Yeah, just look at the highlights on these heads. That's your light source, right? Coming from somewhere up and out here. And who's the only figure turned away from the light? Judas. Light is not just rational, it's also seen to be God. So when you see a light coming through a window, shining on something, that's God. In this case, turning away from the light, turning away from God. So when you're writing up something like a summary essay on this, you want to take these ideas I just talked about, you want to go through your readings, you want to think, well, earlier on too, Colia talked about the context, that's got to be in here as well. Put it all together. Finally, not only did this thing start going to pieces right after he painted it and got overpainted a million times, but this is what it looked like during World War II. Barely survived. Some quick honorable mentions, just going through some of these things fairly quickly so that you see multiple different representations by these artists. But we can't spend as much time on all these as I would love to. This is one of the two versions of Leonardo da Vinci's work called The Madonna of the Rocks, which was a commission created for a church devoted to the Virgin of the Annunciation again. So again, Virgin Mary, basically. And one of the commissions that he created was turned down. What I want to focus on here is a couple of things. Number one, that the composition in this picture should look really familiar. It's just what we would call, in other words, a kind of nativity scene, or a type of, not exactly nativity, but a kind of presentation scene in which you've got the Virgin Mary here, and then you've got the Christ child here, and this is John the Baptist, who's roughly the same age. Again, historically, there's no way these guys were hanging out as little kids, but that's the way that it's represented by Christians, so they grew up kind of together. In any case, in this grouping, again, look at the Virgin Mary. How's she looking? Pretty calm again. You ever seen a young mother like this with children running all over the place? Do they ever look calm and put together? No. So she's perfect again. Beautiful face, perfect proportionality. Why? Because remember, beauty is God. Beauty is truth and goodness. She sits here in her blue. Blue is symbolic. When the Virgin Mary is wearing blue, it's a reference to the fact that she will eventually be queen in heaven. You see her in red, that's going to emphasize her love and her pain, or what's called her passion. So here in blue. What's the one area that stands out that's not blue? This little white sash here. What is that referring to? Well, the abdomen, where Christ came from, as if Christ has just come from this area and been placed down on the earth. And that is always to say, this Christ, who is, again, God made human, is man. He's been made man. What's her shape? Pyramidal. Stability, order. How is the whole thing set up? Well, we look at the Virgin Mary, who's our focus. She looks down at John the Baptist. Implied line then, John the Baptist, who, by the way, is fairly precocious, as is this child. I don't know how old they're supposed to be, but there's a whole bunch of blessing and praying going on already, right? Looks down here, prays to Christ. Christ gives the two-finger blessing back to him, and then we see this figure, probably an angel known as Uriel, pointing us back here and up and around this triangle again, right? Some more terms for you. When someone creates a form that looks 3D by using different values, meaning light and dark, we have a bunch of different terms for that. The main one is called shading, right? The easy kind of colloquial is shading of a form, where things that are closest to a light source, that highlight will be the lightest, and then as they get further away, they get a little bit darker, right? Good way to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. Another term for this, though, is called modeling. And the Italians have their own term for this, which is on your handout, called chiaroscuro, or light and dark. Chiaroscuro. Now, if you're a fancy pants like Leonardo da Vinci and you're really good at this is all oil painting, and you build up that modeling with layers of glazes of oil paint, meaning slightly tinted layers, you can get this really smoky quality to it. And in Leonardo's case, this is called sfumato. Sfumato. S-F-M-U-T-A-O. Fumato. Smoky. Literally means smoky. Then you've got this. You're wondering about this. Well, Leonardo does this in the background of a ton of his pictures, that kind of landscape. It has to do with the more complex idea of chiaroscuro that you would get to if you took an Italian Renaissance class. And it has to do with the place that this kind of presentation took place, or the nativity took place. Remember, we talked before, maybe we talked before in this class, that it either took place in a manger or it took place in a grotto or a cave. You're having that reference to cave here, or nature. All of it starts with line, very strong contour line, disegno. Remember, that's supposed to appeal to the mind. Obviously, the Virgin Mary, all of these figures are meant to be perfect ideals. And he does this over and over again. So this is called the Virgin Child and Saint Anne. Saint Anne is the Virgin Mary's mother, who's up here at the apex of another pyramidal form. And then there's the Virgin Mary, and there's the Christ child, and then there's this poor little lamb here, by the way. The whole thing's piled up in a way that creates this really stable pyramid, but in any other situation, how many people would think this is the weirdest picture I've ever seen? Why is everyone sitting on everyone else's lap, right? It's bizarre. The answer is it's symbolic. We don't know this yet, but in the story of Christianity at this time, the term the Immaculate Conception actually referred to the birth of the Virgin Mary, not Christ. See, the Virgin Mary was thought to have been born without sin as well, meaning without sex. I know, I'm not going to go into this in this class. It's a lot of theology and not a lot of it's in the Bible kind of thing. So what we want to say is something like, Christ came from the Virgin who also came from another virginal birth. This is kind of the genealogy of God. Here's how he gets to earth without original sin tainting him, so that he can be our Savior. That's why they're all piled up this way. They also are all, again, incredibly young and incredibly beautiful. And we won't actually show anything that indicates real human birth in the Renaissance. That's seen as too emotional or too bodily, but we will put Christ between the Virgin's legs. This is about as far as you can go on this, by the way. And you'll get a lot of this. Why is that going on? I mean, again, kids, if you've seen them around animals, can do some pretty crazy things with them. They're all nice at one moment, and then they're like, I'm going to ride the cat. And you're like, stop riding the cat, right? So, but what's going on here? Why do we have a lamb here? Yep. Yeah, so this goes way back in time. Lambs were often used in sacrifices in what the Christians would have called pagan religions, right? This is a sacrifice to a god to get something back in return. Christ becomes known as the symbolic sacrificial lamb. He'll also be associated with being a shepherd. So you see a lot of lambs in pictures with Christ here, but this is a Again, another foreshadowing, what we call the alpha omega symbolism, that at his birth, or in this case his childhood, you still have symbols of something about his death coming down the line. He's, wrangling this lamb here, but what really we're getting at is he's a little kid now, but eventually he's going to sacrifice himself for us. So we put a little symbol of death in with the beginning of his life symbolism here. And there's that sfumato up close. By the way, there's lots and lots of pictures of Christ without his clothes on, if you're wondering about that. Sorry, but Christ is going to be running around. You're going to see a lot more of Christ than maybe you needed to see. Why do they show that all the time? So that you know he's human. This is God made human, so lots of genitalia in Christ. This is not Leonardo da Vinci, but it's after Leonardo da Vinci. It's a work called Leda and the Swan. I just bring it in very, very kind of quick one here. The original work we know existed. There's a lot of writing about it. There's 1 million copies of this thing, but the original is gone missing. We don't know where it is. Leda and the Swan is a story that comes from Greek mythology, and I wanted you to know that Leonardo did create mythological works as well, and historical works too. They've just been lost or destroyed. The story behind this, anyone know this weird story? Yep. Tell me a little bit about it.
Basically, Zeus sees, I don't remember who she's the daughter of, but he turns into a swan and rapes her, and then gives birth to 2 children and 2 eggs.
Okay, good. So, it's again, Greek mythology told 1 million different ways, but the basis of the story is, if you're wondering about this weirdness where Leda's with a swan, and by the way, with a swan, I mean she's with a swan, that swan is actually Zeus. And if you don't know anything about Zeus, Zeus is, how to put it? Zeus is always on the lookout for young, oftentimes attached, sometimes unattached women. He doesn't really care. He'll go for anything that's beautiful, right? And in order to hide himself from his wife, and frankly, because Zeus is married, by the way, in order to hide himself from his wife, and also because supposedly Zeus is so gorgeous that women would be kind of turned to ashes if they saw him in his full majesty, he turns himself into various animals to have sex with women, which is, by the way, the reason Freud really loved Greek mythology. It's weird as shit, right? So here he's turned himself into a swan. He has sex with Leda here. She also, by the way, later in the night has sex with her husband. 2 children are born of each of those couplings. In other words, 2 of these children are Zeus's children. 2 of them are her husband's children here. You don't need to know the story. It doesn't come back in this again. I just wanted you to know that he, of course, represents Greek mythology. I also wanted you to notice this female nude body. What strikes you about this body? It's a body that anyone could have. There's no question about it. I've seen plenty of women that have this body, but by most standards, does this not look like a very masculine body? And at this time, it would have been thought that way. And so the question is, why did he do that? I mean, she looks buff. That's a great body to me, but it's not your typical Renaissance female body. It's certainly not a Botticelli body. It's certainly not what women would have looked like at this time. They're not hitting the gym, right? Women are supposed to do kind of nothing if they're in the upper classes. And the answer, to put it shortly, is the epitome of perfection was always seen to be the male body. And so when you're trying to represent perfection, oftentimes the feminine body gets submitted to a male ideal. The other thing you should be aware of, though, that's in the background of a lot of these things, that's still a matter of contention among art historians, is that a lot of these pictures are considered to have been meant to appeal to men. They are meant to be homoerotic. In this case, we know, for instance, that Leonardo was a gay man, right? And so it's not surprising that what he found beautiful were male bodies. We also know this from Michelangelo. We don't know whether he practiced gay, whether he did anything that was homosexual, but we know he admired the male body a hell of a lot more than he admired the female body. And so when you see female bodies, they're all oftentimes kind of mimicking what we think of as standard male bodies. And then this one, right? The Mona Lisa. I told you on the first day that one of the ways that this work became such an icon of Western art had to do with some mystery around it, including the mystery of its disappearance at the beginning of the 20th century. It became a media phenomenon, and that's one of the reasons that people pay it a lot of attention. I'm not saying it's not a great, very well painted picture. It is. It's beautifully painted. But there's a lot of beautifully painted pictures out there. And remember, this is just a portrait. It's not even an ambitious work. It's not like the Last Supper scene that you just saw. It's not like those virgin scenes that you just saw. This is just a portrait. This is the way that artists got paid, right? This is the way that they would spend 2 or 3 years on some works of art and get not much out of it. They were doing it because of their love of God or for their patron or to, make their mark on history. But the way they got paid was with the help of huge workshops behind them, they would churn out portraits, and this is one of those. For a long time, people didn't know who this was, and for a long time, people seem to have forgotten that Leonardo was a gay man. So there's all this speculation about this being his mistress or his girlfriend, and that's what has to do with the mysterious smile. It's not, right? Or almost assuredly not. This is probably Lisa Gerardini del Giocondo, a Florentine merchant's wife who sat for Leonardo. He was probably, in my estimation, still painting this picture, which is why he never gave it to her when he left for France to spend the last years of his career working in the French court. The background still isn't quite right? Look at the horizon here. It's above this over here. He was starting to fix things, change things around. He hadn't quite finished it. So there's not much to this really to talk about here other than historically, why did this get so famous? Well, mainly a matter of, media frenzy. So let's move on to Raphael. Raphael Sanzio, or Raphael Santi as he's sometimes called, was a follower of Perugino. He studied under Perugino, the guy who did the crucifix that I showed you on day number 1, the really pretty one. He is, unlike Leonardo or Michelangelo, I always like to point out, he was an incredibly graceful social actor. He got along with everyone. He always knew the right things to say, very charismatic. You'd see even a ton more of his work had he not died fairly young. He died in his early 30s, as I recall. So he would have gone on to do even greater things. He had a huge workshop behind him, and he started his career really by making a heck of a lot of money on a subject that's near and dear to Italians, which is scenes of the Virgin Mary. Oftentimes scenes of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child, or Christ and John the Baptist. These were Is this back on? Yeah. Okay, so help me out. Our watchword is always going to be ideal, isn't it? So how's this ideal? Yeah.
Jesus, even as a baby, already looks sort of mature and fully formed and not emotional.
Okay, so yeah, we're going to struggle with Jesus here, aren't we, a little bit? How many people are like, ideal? Well, he's a chunky little monkey, isn't he, right? He's very healthy, he's very robust. I don't think I've said this before, but so you know, of course, this is, there are a whole host of reasons you want to be a little bit skeptical or, critical of this, but we tend to represent our most esteemed figures like us. So even though Jesus obviously and the Virgin Mary came from the Middle East, came from Semitic roots without any question, they're always going to look like Northern Italianers. They're always going to look blonde, blue-eyed, kind of fair-skinned Europeans, in other words, because the Europeans here are representing them. I mean, there's no way that complexion does very well in the Middle East, right? No way. So you've got, he looks pretty calm. He's not all squirmy. He's not like pulling his mom's hair out or something like that.
Something I noticed that baby Jesus looks weightless.
Yeah.
Mary's holding her, there's not much, not heavy at all.
Excellent. I mean, and he looks heavy. So the fact that he's just kind of floating there, or the Virgin Mary's just like totally buff and you can't tell it, holding him up, no problem, right? Just with this really delicate hand, no problem, got him up there. Good. How about the Virgin Mary? I mean, beautiful, right? Beautiful, perfect symmetry, everything placed in the right place. Again, I don't want to overuse this joke, but if you've seen young mothers, they don't look like this. They look like they're barely holding it together, right? I mean, she's got that look on her face that's riposo, inner calm. And the whole thing's pyramidal. Her clothes are all, in the right place. Why doesn't Jesus have any clothes on again? So we can know that he's human. Everything's foreground, then wall, right? Middle ground, then background. You don't need to know these things, but this isn't the case. In this one, this is actually a church of his friend Bramante, who he just built. But in a lot of these pictures, you'll see a little house in the background. That's oftentimes the house, the country villa of the first patron of these works of art, for instance. How about this one? I mean, this is my favorite of his Madonna and Child works, mainly because of Jesus here. This pose, by the way, if we haven't gotten this term yet, this pose where you have a characteristic weight shift, where in the medieval period everyone looks like this, and then you go like this, back onto one hip, it's called Contrapposto. Basically means counterpoint. It gets used in a lot of different ways, but in art it means this weight shift. That's very, very natural. And again, I don't know what age he's supposed to be, a year old or something, but he's already just like languid contrapposto thing out there. Who's his buddy? John the Baptist. John the Baptist has, by the way, his typical iconography. John the Baptist was a wild man of the woods, hanging out in the River Jordan, baptizing people. So what you see him is, again, 1 year old, he's already got like a fur onesie on. Fur and John the Baptist go together. You see little kids wearing fur, old men fur, lots of beard, lots of shaggy hair. Pretty sure you're looking at John the Baptist. So look at his hair, already looks a little shaggy, John the Baptist. What's the composition? Once again, pyramidal form. What's the look on her face? Riposo, inner calm, just like Baldassare di Castiglione said in his writing, right? This is what or rather, Raphael's writing to Baldassare di Castiglione. This, by the way, is a portrait by Raphael of this man. Oops, let's go back here again. Got enough time to do a little reading while you're taking care of a couple of kids, right? Pyramidal foreground, middle ground, background. How is this telling the story? And again, it's making it ideal. This is the perfect way to act. These are the perfect children. So how about this one? How many people have seen this before somewhere? Or at least this before somewhere? Yeah? This is his famous Sistine Madonna. This one's a little bit more complex, so we'll spend a little bit more time on it. In this case, Raphael became, as you'll see in a moment, one of the chief painters for the major pope of the High Renaissance, whose name is Julius II. And unfortunately, you do have to remember this name. I'm not going to make you remember any other pope, but Julius II you need to remember. Julius II is the guy who had Michelangelo paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He's the guy who will have Raphael do all of the paintings in the Vatican libraries, the stanza that you'll see in a moment. He's the guy who started the renovation of St. Peter's, the St. Peter's that you know today. He was the guy who threw a heck of a lot of money into the arts, in other words. He made a lot of money himself. It was a very prosperous era. By the way, the papacy at this time had its own standing army, and he was out taking over areas as well. He thought of himself, believe it or not, as the warrior pope. Today, I don't think we would think those go together, but the warrior pope, a man of action. When he was dying, he had, while his later years in life, he had a number of works created, commissioned to memorialize his death, including a work that you'll see by Michelangelo that never got finished, and this painting that was started during his life but then didn't get finished until after his death. This is a memorial portrait to Julius II. So what we're witnessing here is Julius II is basically in our space. And this guy here, although oftentimes identified as Julius II, is most likely one of his ancestors. Again, Clement VII, but you don't need to remember that, who is allowing him into this scene, or inviting him into the scene. He's died. He's being welcomed into heaven by the Virgin Mary and the Christ child here. You can see in the background these curtains have pulled away. This cloud, this kind of nimbus of light around him, which is a symbol of holiness, little faces here. Those are all souls. And it's as if this is so important, this man who's just died, it's so important that we all have come out to welcome him into heaven. On this side, that's St. Barbara. St. Barbara is the patron saint of men-at-arms, of soldiers, included in this scene. So high drama. She walks out on the cloud. We're invited in this space. He's being invited in. And then these two figures. Now we have names for these. They're either called Cherubim or Putti. P-U-T-T-I, which I prefer. And they are a form of angel, usually thrown in there for comic relief or just some kind of incidental relief. In this case, they are here for comic relief, just totally bored. Yeah, it's another one of these fancy popes, thinks he's so important. We've seen this a million times, right? Bored. Contrast to the rest of the seriousness. Some other things, though, that I want to point out about this work, and we could stay on this forever, are some of the techniques that Raphael uses to kind of trick us. When artists paint in hyper-illusionistic style, we call that trompe-l'oeil, or fool the eye. Trompe-l'oeil is French for fool the eye. I don't care if you remember trompe-l'oeil. However, you should be able to recognize that when you read it, right? Because they'll use that term all the time rather than fool the eye. So trompe-l'oeil or fool the eye, hyper-illusionistic painting. In this case, it's as if they're sitting on a ledge here. Really makes us think that they're there. Another term that I want you to know about is another technique that an artist can use to create the illusion of three-dimensionality is what's called foreshortening. So if I asked all of you to draw my arm like this, how many people are like, it might not be totally accurate, but I think I could do something like that. How about if I did this? People on the sides are like, I'm still okay. These people in the front are like, no, I don't know how to do that. That's hard, right? That's what's going on here. This hand is reaching out towards us like this. That's really hard to paint. One of the things it does is it points into our space and includes our space in there. It invokes us in the scene. It makes us feel like we're participating. But it also is a way for Raphael to show off. Look at how good I am. I can trick you into thinking this is pointing right at you. So again, let's practice a little bit here. Let's say I threw this work up in front of you and I said something like this. This is Raphael's The Marriage of the Virgin Mary. I want you to tell me why this is a really good example of the high Renaissance in Italy. Take me through the steps, right? So let me tell you what the story is. For those of you who don't know, Virgin Mary, of course, been chosen by God. She needs to be married now. And so she's not really going to pick her own partner. Someone else is going to pick it for her, and that someone else is really God in this story. What happens is all the potential suitors for the Virgin Mary come to the temple, and according to old kind of language, they lay their rods on the temple, which is meant to be these kind of sticks of wood, basically, piece of wood or branches. And whoever's rod flowers is the one chosen by God to be her consort, to be her husband. So you've witnessed that already having occurred. Joseph's rod has flowered. Now, tell me, how is this a really good example of the High Renaissance in Italy? Turn to your nearest 2 or 3 neighbors and share your thoughts. Just tick your way through the list. Ideals. In which ways is this work ideal? Turn to your neighbors. So Raphael was almost always called by later historians like the person who perfected classicism. He was a person that when you, later in this quarter, you're looking at times where artists and teachers pointed backwards and said, there's the perfect guide to follow. It was Raphael over and over again. In other words, he's kind of set up for an art history class for that question to occur, which is why his work, not this one, The School of Athens, will be your other major summary essay option. So we look at this work, and why is this really exemplary of high Renaissance classical stylistics and values and so forth? Give me one thing, just one thing. Anyone? Yeah.
Well, the vanishing point through the doorway in the background has all the lines like really directly.
Yeah, so these lines, you don't need to remember this, but they're called orthogonals, all recede back to the temple, right? Every single one of us showing you that he's using linear one-point perspective. Why is that important? Ideal space. Yes, back in the hat. Perfect symmetry. Split it down the middle, equal weight on both sides, and for the most part, especially in the foreground, kind of mimicking of the figures. A little bit different back here, but pretty darn close to perfect symmetry. Certainly very balanced. Yeah?
You had the references of like the clergy being close to the Holy Spirits, and like it was putting them closer to God than like the other people.
Okay, so what we got going on here is look at the orthogonals here in the foreground. First person back, right in the middle of this, the priest. And then the Virgin Mary. Notice how Joseph's a little bit further on the outside of this. That's a way of saying holy, 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 right, in a kind of order here. What else? Yep.
All the faces are kind of like representative of that riposo, kind of very calm.
Got very calm faces. No one's too happy about this. No one's very sad. Although you notice some of this, right? What's this guy doing? He's breaking his rod. But look at that. That's like the world's worst acting job, isn't it? It's like, I'm so mad that I didn't get to be her husband. It's like, whatever. So that's as much emotion as you can muster here. Again, because you're not supposed to be emotional. Emotions are antithetical to rational thinking and so forth. How about this? They're all exactly the same height, aren't they? What is that going to tell you? It's called isocephalic. You don't need to remember that. Same height, though. What does that mean? What is that likely to tell you? Yeah, you're all like, I don't know. They're all born to the same parents. No, that's not right. It means they're all based on the same kind of canon of proportions. Right? So same, if we were to go through this and kind of measure out those bodies and their fingers and their hands, everything's been created through a canon of proportions, or roughly. The poses of these figures, right? Nice graceful poses. And then we've got foreground, middle ground, background with atmospheric perspective back here. Perfect centering of the church here. Again, that's not what the church would have looked like in this time. That's something that's very Renaissance.
So around the priest, you have the inverted triangle dead space.
Okay.
I was wondering if that might symbolize anything.
I think it's just a really good, does it symbolize the same kind of instability as the last one? No, because it's not set up with that thematic. But what he's noticing is all of these uses of what we call negative space, and notice how he mirrors this, right? There's a triangle, there's a triangle. I think that's really what we're getting at, kind of mirroring shapes in that symmetry. Nice ordering of those. Yep. Are you talking about these shadows and these shadows? So all just rational. This is a light source on this side casting shadows. It's very high in the air. All of these things would have been determined probably upon even the space in which this thing was housed. So very rational light source of the sun at its highest probably point here. Is that what you're getting at? Just why are the shadows in there?
Well, no, but the people on the left don't have shadows.
They do. They're just longer. I don't know if they're supposed to be skinnier or what. These guys do too. They're there. Yeah. And he's emulating his this is his teacher, Perugino, doing a work called The Delivery of the Keys to St. Peter. He's basically lifted the same grouping out of this. He's just simplified it. And I bring this in to tell you something. Remember, these artists aren't really about creating originality and creativity in the same way we think of it today. They very much drew upon each other. It was expected. You were trying to make it one step better than who came before. Does someone have a question over here?
Yeah, is there some sort of meaning behind that sort of beggar figure with figure on the right in the middle ground?
This figure? Yeah. There probably is, but I don't know it. Yeah, I'm sure there is. Why is he not in there? Yeah.
Is the gold on Joseph important? Because gold isn't super common throughout the other figures.
It is, but now we get into tricky areas, so I might as well bring this up now. When people of this time would have looked at these canvases, they would have seen these not just as brilliant colors full of symbolism, they would have seen it as wealth. Oftentimes gold is actually gold leaf or gold fleck suspended in linseed oil. Blue, by the way, I don't know if we said this in this class. Again, they're not running down to Daniel Smith and buying paints, right? So blue was created out of crushing up lapis lazuli, which is a semi-precious stone, and suspending it in various binders, right? Red as well, very expensive colors. So when you see gold in here, gold is oftentimes one of those kind of holy colors. Anything that is gold is associated with God and the sun and light, going all the way back to Egyptian times. And it's also a way that, again, these things are written in the contracts of these works. You'll go look at the contract and it'll say, I'm willing to spend this much on gold, and then they'll figure out which characters to put it on. Okay, so I'll introduce this work, but we're not going to get into it until Wednesday. This is another one of the major works of art for your summary essay. You'll either be able to choose the option of the Leonardo's Last Supper or this work the one that's over here on the left, usually referred to as the School of Athens. So the setup for this is that Pope Julius II at this time, and by the way, this work is roughly created at the same time as the Sistine Chapel ceiling. They're both working on these commissions simultaneously. Raphael's in the cushy job in the Vatican libraries. Michelangelo's out there in the crappy Sistine Chapel ceiling, half on his back, trying to paint that ceiling. At this point, Raphael has been appointed by Julius II as basically the head painter and the director of all archaeological and architectural projects in Rome. This is a big thing, like he's his favorite painter in a way. And he gives him this commission to cover these four walls of the Stanza della Signatura, the room of the signatures, as it's called, which was an important place. It was a place where the Pope brought people to sign important papal documents and so forth. So it's a very public space with different forms of what he called law or truth. One wall, this wall, was truth based upon ancient Greek philosophy. And so you see a bunch of philosophers there, somehow in Athens, kind of all piled up into one space. They all lived at different times, representing that access point to truth. Facing this on the opposite wall was this work that we'll also look at very briefly, which is known as the Disputa. It's the dispute or the controversy over the exact nature of the Holy Sacrament, or the body and blood of Christ, which we'll get to in a bit. And then there's other ones. There's the virtues under poetry and under law itself. So when we get into this, what I want you to do before you come in on Wednesday is I want you to look this work over. I want you to think about Renaissance values, and I want you to think about this fundamental question that I want us to be working on early in the quarter, just to get us to look closely. And that's, how is this work a perfect example of high Renaissance classical aesthetics, right? How is this perfect? So again, what we're looking at is, this is all trompe-l'oeil, by the way. This part right here, that's all painted, but this right here is architecture. This is architecture, right? So he's painted it to look as if you can't tell the difference between the real architecture and the architecture he's painted. It's painted in buonafresco. So that's him painting on wet plaster so that as it dries, it binds to that wet plaster and will remain much more durable than anything else. It's incredibly difficult technically, right? It is an example of what the Renaissance used to say about these paintings. They are like a picture onto another world. The Renaissance view of a painting is it's a window onto another world, as if you're separated from that scene, kind of witnessing it. And here you get to see Plato in the center and Aristotle, and Plato's pointing up to that realm of forms, and Aristotle saying, no, it's down here in the world around us. Plato holds under his arm the Timaeus, and Aristotle the Nicomachean Ethics, these two major texts that they wrote that are about their theories. And of course we know that Neoplatonism and the aesthetic philosophy of classicism rectifies these two belief systems together with the theology of Christianity. But we'll get into the specifics of this on Wednesday. Does anyone have any last minute questions? So I want to give you one reminder here, and this will be your last reminder on this. I know you guys can multitask. I can't. So I don't want you on your phones while I'm lecturing. If you need to be on your phones for something important, please step out in the hall. Okay? All right. I'll see you on Wednesday. Hi. Okay.
I know we're doing a paper super soon.
Yeah.
I assume you talked about that.
So, did she already leave? The person that is most important for you to check in with is the TA, Haley. My lectures are all on, yeah. So when you get there, just check in with her, and you may need to meet with one of us during office hours to find out what you missed. But you can get my lectures on tomorrow. This class is on the lectures.
Okay, thank you so much.
That sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned
Tired already. You doing okay? Yeah? Okay. All right, so Raphael's School of Athens in the Stanza della Signatura in the Vatican. Very important room. This is a fresco painting. Remember what fresco buono is. And again, one of the ways to study for all your exams is you have your lecture guides. When you look at your lecture guides, you have at the top, most often at the top, some big ideas that will be applicable to many, many different parts of the lecture. In this case, in lecture guide number 1, you had things that were primarily associated with the context. Then you have artist names, titles of works, and dates. And then below that, you have a whole list of names and terms and so forth. These are all things that show up in the lecture or show up in the reading, and you should absolutely be able to say, hey, who the heck's Verrocchio? Why is that important in this? And be able to know that stuff. When you're studying for an exam, if you look at this and you think, I don't know any of these ideas here, you're in trouble, right? You're going to want to go look those up, look over the Panopto lectures again, make sure that you know those things. So in this case, we're on the School of Athens, Stanza della Signatura, very good example of the high Renaissance style in Italy. I mean, it's almost as if this work was created specifically for art historians to have this question on an exam, like, why is this an excellent example of the high Renaissance style in Italy? So let's start with the subject matter itself. So the subject matter, what we're actually seeing. The subject is a kind of synthesis of different figures through time, starting in Greek times, a couple of people from Roman times, and a couple of people beyond that. So Neoplatonists, in other words, later day philosophers, all put in one space, representing the subject of basically humanistic knowledges. They're not all just philosophers, most of them are, but there's people like Euclid in there as well. So we've got some scientists in there as well, mathematicians, geometrists, and so forth. And the idea is that this is a humanistic branch of how you get knowledge. And it's juxtaposed, as I said last time, straight across from it is the realm of religious knowledge. So he's trying to cover all of the bases. We've got religious knowledge, poetry, cardinal virtues under law, and philosophy. So we've got, for instance, in the center, and remember, this is your focal point, so this is the place that you think this is the most important thing, Plato and Aristotle. And Plato points up to the realm of forms, and you should be able to explain why that's important, what that realm of forms or concepts is. It says that's where all truth resides. And Aristotle, by the way, they didn't live contemporaneously, right? These people are all compiled into one space, but they didn't live at the same time. Says, no. It's down here in the earth. It subtends or exists beneath the appearance of all things, that order. That's where you find it. They're locked in a kind of endless debate about this. Those two thinkers together, along with, again, Christian theology, represent Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonic ideas have been around since basically, Christianity had been around. And so there's no kind of one set of ideas that are strictly speaking Neoplatonic. But for the purposes of this class, what I keep kind of emphasizing is that basic idea where you have God, the divine craftsman. He made this world. He made us in his image. Therefore, there's something of his perfection in us. And an artist's job is to show you the perfect world, to show you perfection. That will bring you into contact with God, right? They're mediators of God. Or another way to put this is to read you a quote, right? This is from Leonardo. He says, quote, "If you despise painting, which is the sole imitator of all visible works of nature, you certainly will be despising the subtle invention which brings philosophy and subtle speculation bear on the nature of all forms, sea, land, plants, animals, grasses, flowers, which are enveloped in shade and light. Truly, painting is a science, the true-born child of nature. For painting is born of nature. To be more correct, we should call it the grandchild of nature, since all visible things are brought forth by nature, and these, her children, have given birth to painting. Therefore, we may justly speak of it as the grandchild of nature and as related to God." All that like genealogy there, child, grandchild, that's all Platonic ideas. That's basically Plato saying there's that realm of forms, that's the Father, that's God for Neoplatonists, right? Father for Neoplatonists, and it's just, again, for Plato, the realm of forms, who begets us in his image and this world. There we've got the child. And now we've got painting that is finding in the child, in nature, the perfection of form, a la Aristotle, see it beneath the appearance of things, and making it available to us as the, quote, grandchild. I know it's complex, but that's how you decode these readings. They're all kind of analogs and so forth. So there they are in the center, and Plato holds under his arm the Timaeus, his major text, which you can read right on the binding. And Aristotle holds the Nicomachean Ethics, his major text, on the idea that order exists beneath the appearance of nature. They are the focal point because they are the vanishing point for a central one-point perspective. Follow all of these lines, the orthogonals, back, and they all stop there. They're also dead in the center. They are also framed in contrast against the light background. We've seen this before, right? This is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper again. They're also successively framed by these archways that lead you into them. No one overlaps them. That's typical Renaissance organization. Very, very rational. Look here first. This is important. Then you look at these characters, and along the orthogonals you might see other important people. This is Michelangelo as Heraclitus in the foreground. This over here is Bramante as Euclid here, teaching geometry. This over here is actually Raphael, way off to the sideline, acting humble. When you look at this work again, you'll notice that it's very unified, everything tied together. So we look at Plato, he points up. Notice how all of these figures look at him, more implied lines pointing to them. You've got this kind of arm up next to these, and then all in a row, ding, 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 and then an arm linking this, another arm here. If you've got any spaces here for emphasis to allow you to see the sculptures, look at what happens. Arm reaches out, connecting these two. Get here. Look at this line of the edge of the arm, points down to this end of the arm, through this kind of bald head that's exactly the same, through this highlight to this figure, and then you just work your way around the foreground. Everything's very structured. Everything's very ordered. Meant to move you around it systematically. Meant to link all of the characters together. When something needs to be emphasized, Plotinus over here, notice how he's given his own space. That guy must be important, right? Yeah, he's one of the major Neoplatonic thinkers, so you're going to emphasize him in there. The other big thing about this, though, in the subject matter is, remember, they are putting Renaissance artists' faces on these classical thinkers. This is very interesting because, remember, before this time period, before the Renaissance, artists were just craftspeople. They're very skilled laborers, but you didn't think of them as someone who had special access to God or were doing anything that could provide you with knowledge. But at this point, remember, artists are saying, no, 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 we're much more than that. We're the mediators for God. So when you put, for instance, Leonardo da Vinci's face on Plato, what are you saying? Well, one of the things you're saying is Leonardo's like a classical philosopher, right? He's a thinker. He's someone who has access to knowledge. And on the other hand, you're saying we are like them. We are the Renaissance. We are the rebirth of these classical thinkers, right? I don't know how many of you did this. When I was a little kid and I had like a major, usually it was a sports figure I wanted to be like, I would like act like them, right? You put on clothes that were kind of like them and you'd act like them. Everyone do something goofy like this. You still do it a little bit. I do it every once in a while. Barcelona, by the way, is playing Man U today, so I'm all up on Barcelona today. Anyway, too much knowledge, right? So here you go, right? You wear these things and you act like them. Yeah, and I was a little, frankly, short white guy, and I liked Michael Jordan for a while. And I don't know if you saw this Michael Jordan where he's dunking. The hoop's like up here, but I remember doing this with my friends, like, we're going to dunk or whatever. That's what they're doing. They're saying, I'm like them. I want to be like them. You're claiming a sense of identity based upon the classical past. We are the rebirth of this. Then let's go on from that. What else is in this picture that's worth kind of paying attention to? Well, someone brought it up last time. Again, there's some terms you need to know. Hyper-illusionistic painting, things that trick you into thinking what you're looking at is real, or in this case, as if you're looking through a window, that Renaissance window onto another more perfect world. We call that trompe-l'oeil. It's a term on your lecture guide, trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye. Hyper-illusionistic painting. This kind of painting here, in which you paint in gray tones so as to mimic the look of sculpture, and in this case it's pretty trompe-l'oeil as well, is specifically called grisaille. Gris in French is gray, so grisaille means gray tone painting, basically. It's meant to make you think you're looking at these sculptures. Now, the reason I give you these terms is I don't want you to, in the middle of an essay that you're writing for me, say, hey, this is all painted in gray tones, also known as grisaille. What I want you to do is just integrate the proper terminology into your essay and say, the grisaille painting of these figures here, da-da-da-da, all know you know how to use that term. In this case, who is that? Who is that? Someone help me out. Who is this? That's Apollo. Okay, what do we know about Apollo in this class? We haven't learned anything about him, but in Greek mythology, what does Apollo represent? He's a god of the sun. He's a god of beauty. He's the most beautiful of the gods. He's a god of music and poetry, so the arts. And he's a very, very rational god. And remember, rationality is key. So all of the other gods usually get pissed off and do something crazy, or Zeus is always on the lookout for ladies. Very sensual, very questionable in their rationality, but Apollo for the most part is pretty even keel. So he represents art, rationality, and beauty here. On the other side, who is that? Athena, or Minerva, as she's known by the Romans. For those who get tripped up on this, either term will work for me. We're in Italy, so they tend to use the name of the Italian gods. I tend to be snobbish about this and say, well, they are Greek gods first and use the Greek god names, but either one would work. If you don't already know this, the Romans basically adopted the entire pantheon of Greek gods and gave them new names, primarily names that we associate with planets. So here we've got Athena. What does she represent? Knowledge, wisdom, right? Wisdom, and wisdom in warfare. She is the strategian. And that's important here because the person who commissioned this work is Pope Julius II, who, again, fancied himself as the warrior pope. So we have strategy and war associated specifically with his patron, but also just wisdom in general, knowledge in general. And again, she's all about rationality. Nothing sensual about Athena. When Athena is born, and the way you can always tell us in Greek mythology is the way that those gods are born. Athena springs fully formed out of the head of Zeus. There's no sex involved in all, right? It's all just intellection. So here you've got two gods. Why do you think they represented them? Because what are we saying about the Renaissance style, about classical philosophy, about Neoplatonic aesthetic philosophy? We're saying it's about beauty giving you knowledge, right? Art giving you knowledge. And you've got these two gods that represent that. Keep looking at this, and a number of you will say, hey, I've got an idea here. Let's go through the stylistics of this. What else is ideal about this? Someone just shout one thing that's like, that's ideal. One thing. You're in the dark. No one will see you. You can say anything. I'll pretend it came from over there. Go ahead.
Proportion of the figures.
Okay, proportion of the figures, right? We have ideal proportions to the figures, all canons of proportion. Start with that. Always going to be like that. Notice how the vast majority of them are exactly the same height, exactly the same build. Every once in a while you have a guy who's a little bit taller, but he just looks like the same proportionality. What else? We're all made in God's image, right? So you have to create that ideal form. What else is ideal? Again, tick your way through the formal elements. How about the composition here? What would you say about this composition? Is it balanced? Yes, it's balanced. Roughly symmetrical? Yes. Right? Easy to take. What is the compositional structure? Primarily horizontals and verticals. Aren't they very, very stable things? The way you observe the world, you're a vertical being against a horizontal ground plane. Very, very comfortable. Not a lot of diagonals in here. Then you've got this weird pyramidal form here, that open space in the middle. That's also stable. How about the color scheme? A lot of primary colors, little dots of it, more intense colors, but roughly speaking, these are all analogous. Don't put a lot of complementary colors next to each other. Again, analogous colors tend to harmonize, don't they? This is also seen as ideal. Rational, yeah, it's all about, the subject matter starts with rationality. Clear, yes. Foreground, middle ground, background, certainly in here. Central point perspective, what am I harping on about central linear perspective about? Why is that important in this? It's not reality, it's better than reality. It's perfect space. Perfect space. That grid that underlies all space that God put into the universe, and on and on and on. You with me so far? So let's talk about a couple of other things in here. What's Michelangelo doing besides brooding as he was wanting to do? What's he doing here? He's this guy. Writing. Is he writing? He's drawing on that marble block. This is apparently how Michelangelo created sculpture. He would draw basically like figures on the block and then carve out the form. It's a famous quote that I'll give you in a minute when we get to Michelangelo. He says, a single block of marble does not potentially contains within it everything that you need, and all I do is clear away the extra stuff. So there it is. He's at work. He's set up right in the foreground, so he's given a prominent position. Right at the same time period this is being created, he's down the way working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And if you're looking at this and you're saying, it's kind of weird that this gets kind of asymmetrical with this dude, how many people think this guy's the odd guy out, by the way? It just looks kind of weird. Everything else looks very ordered, then you've got just this dude lounging on the stairs. Right? This is totally speculation, completely anecdotal. Most Renaissance historians would say, no, that's not what's going on here. But for a while, people believed that what happened is that Raphael was, of course, a competitor with Michelangelo when it came to these various commissions. And Michelangelo got stuck with a crummy job, right? The Sistine Chapel was a crummy job. He didn't want to do it. He's over there, on his back, kind of griping, bitching, and moaning about he wants to go back to do sculpture and so forth. And Raphael's got the cush job here in the Stanza della Signatura. Michelangelo was notorious for keeping his Sistine Chapel very secret, didn't want anyone to see it. But supposedly Bramante, this guy over here, a friend of Raphael's and an architect, and Raphael sneaked in to see the Sistine Chapel ceiling, saw it, and were just overwhelmed with how excellent it was. And stories have it, and we see this in some of the early studies of the School of Athens, that it's at that moment that Raphael determines that he needs to give Michelangelo a new, more prominent place in this painting, right in the foreground. So he changed his ideas along the way, paints him in there. But now you're left with an artistic problem, aren't you? Who do you put up here to balance him out? And we've already seen that Raphael likes to, he's very socially graceful. He's over here with his friend Sodoma, just hanging out, being, nondescript. I'm just kind of in the scene, but I don't want to make a big deal out of how great I am. So how do you deal with that? And the way they seem to have dealt with it is to put this figure in here a little bit back so as to not vie for our attention here, but still somewhat balance it out. He looks awkward as hell, but actually his axis of his body is directly along the orthogonal. It goes straight through his body here. And he is either Socrates, who will die by drinking hemlock, or more likely the cynic philosopher of his age, whose name is escaping me, but it'll come back to me in a minute here. So let's get up close on this. You don't need to remember this. But many of these figures are, Diogenes is his name, Diogenes. Many of these people are very, very recognizable. We know who they are. We know who their portraits are. This is your central one-point perspective that meets right about here, right? All lines in the composition lead there. Here's a close-up of some of these figures, right? There's Raphael off to the side, Bramante over here teaching geometry. He's the architect of the time. And then finally, this one thing. At this time, Raphael is the director of all archaeological and architectural programs in Rome. So he's got a big job here. And he was tasked with coming up with the first designs for the renovation of St. Peter's Cathedral. St. Peter's as it looks today. He didn't go on to do this. He died too young to do that. It was turned over to Michelangelo and others after him. But at the time, people believed that the anachronism of this architectural space, which after all, if we're in Athens, what's wrong with this architecture? It's Roman, right? It's got the Roman arch in there. The Greeks didn't know anything about the Roman arch yet. But there's an explanation for that. This may be Raphael imagining what the new St. Peter's would look like, which would have absolutely used the Roman arch and included that architecture in this, again, mythical scene of the bringing together of all these great thinkers of the time. Make sure you write down all these types of specific things in your notes. You won't remember them going forward, and they're absolutely things that when you get to an exam and you're like, well, I didn't bring that up, and I didn't bring that up, and I didn't bring that up, I forgot to put those in my notes, will be detracted from your essays. Those are the types of specific details that should be in your essays. And then facing this across the way is a work that we're not getting into in any detail. It's called the Disputa. And it brings together various theologians, so religious thinkers through the ages, people like Augustine and various popes and so forth. And what they're doing is they're locked in a debate about the true nature of the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is the body of Christ, which is housed in this thing here, that little wafer or the bread that you see in the Last Supper. And they're saying, what is this exactly? How did this exactly occur? When we're in Mass, the question was, is this little wafer actually really the body of Christ? Is it transubstantiated, is what they would say. And this has been, again, most of us are like, who cares, right? But theologically, this is a debate that had raged for years. What is the nature of this? And it will be a debate, by the way, that continues with the Protestants and the Catholics in short order here. So they're in this debate, again, through time, and then up above, sitting above this, in perfect order, again, very Neoplatonic, isn't it? Perfect order up above, that's heaven, that's Plato's realm of forms, are the elect, Jesus in the center, Virgin Mary on one side, John the Baptist on the other side, God the Father above, the Holy Spirit in his hand here, Holy Spirit here. What is the nature of all of this? Well, up here, everything's perfect, everything's ordered. Down here, in our material realm, everything's a little chaotic. We don't know, but we presume that God would know the answer to these